But nature at times has its own plans. When the majestic albino lion emerged from the shadows, its eyes revealed not the expected fury, but a strange understanding. It approached the bound figure, not with the intent to attack, but with an ancient curiosity. With slow, deliberate movements, the beast began to gnaw at the ropes that bound the grandmother, freeing her from the cruel trap. The hunter, watching from afar, felt a shiver of terror. His plan was crumbling. The lion now was no longer prey, but a guardian. With a roar that made the earth tremble, the beast cornered Elias, not tearing him apart, but mercilessly pushing him into a hidden pit, full of sharp thorns. There, deep in the earth, the villain would be delivered to his own version of nature, a wild and relentless justice. The thud was dry, brutal. Elias felt the air expelled from his lungs in a hoarse, choked groan. The fall wasn't long, but the impact was devastating, not only from the physical shock, but from the terrible truth materializing beneath his body. Thorns, hundreds of them, sharp as obsidian needles, pierced his skin, tearing his clothes and embedding themselves in his flesh with a ferocity that surpassed any pain he had ever felt. A cry of agony escaped his throat, echoing off the damp, dark walls of the pit. He writhed, trying to free himself from those natural claws, but each movement only served to deepen the barbs, to tear his skin further, to spread the poison of pain throughout his entire being. The smell of wet earth and fresh blood filled his nostrils, mixing with the metallic tang of panic. Elias was trapped, completely trapped. The darkness of the pit seemed to suck away the light, leaving him in an abyss of despair. He looked up, and the circular opening at the top looked like a gigantic eye watching him. And there, silhouetted against the pale evening sky, they stood. The imposing figure of the albino lion, and beside it, the small, stooped figure of his grandmother. Terror chilled his veins. It wasn't just the pain of the thorns, but the humiliation, the grotesque inversion of his plan. He, the ruthless hunter, was now in the trap, the prey, and the lion, the creature he so coveted, was his silent executioner, his judge. The beast no longer roared. It merely watched, its eyes red like embers, fixed on him, an ancient intelligence shining in its gaze. There was no fury, only a calculating calm, the certainty of a justice that needed no words. "Grandma! Grandma, help me!" Elias managed to stammer, his voice hoarse and weak, almost inaudible. Panic drove him, the irrational hope that his own flesh and blood would save him. "Get me out of here, please!" Up above, the grandmother, freed from the rope, stumbled a step back. Her eyes, once filled with terror and resignation, now reflected a complex mix of shock, disbelief, and something more. Something Elias couldn't decipher, but which terrified him more than the thorns. It was a stillness, an absence of immediate reaction that spoke volumes. She was free, yes, but freedom came with a price, a brutal revelation about the nature of her own grandson. She looked at the lion, who had been her tormentor and was now her savior. The beast, majestic and serene, showed no aggression towards her, only an imposing, protective presence. Then her tired eyes returned to the hole, to the twisted, agonizing figure of Elias. The image of him, who died to the tree moments before, was still fresh in her mind. The betrayal, the cold, calculating cruelty. The fear she had felt, the acceptance of imminent death at the hands of her own grandson. A tremor ran through the elderly woman's body, not from cold, but from a deep and contradictory emotion. It was her grandson, her own flesh and blood, now caught in his own trap. The one who had delivered her to death now pleaded for her help. The instinct of a mother, of a grandmother, to care, to protect, fought against the open wound of betrayal, against the image of the monster he had revealed himself to be. Elias tried to stand, but the thorns held him fast, tearing deeper. A trickle of blood ran down his face, mixing with cold sweat. "Grandma, please, I didn't mean to. It was a mistake, I swear." The words were desperate, hollow, even to him. The truth was, he did mean to. He wanted the trophy, the glory, the money, and she was just a means to that end. The lion let out a low growl, almost imperceptible, a warning. Not for the grandmother, but for Elias, a reminder of who was in control. The grandmother took another hesitant step towards the edge of the pit. She looked at her grandson, his face contorted with pain and fear. And then her eyes met those of the albino lion. In that wild gaze, she saw not cruelty, but ancient wisdom, a scale of justice that weighed the deeds of men. The sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, casting long, distorted shadows over the scene. The savannah, once silent, began to awaken with the sounds of night, the croaking of frogs, the buzzing of insects, the rustling of leaves. Nature, indifferent to human drama, ran its course. And Elias, at the bottom of the thorn pit, felt the cold of night approach, and with it the certainty that his grandmother, the only person who might save him, was in a dilemma he himself had created. Her choice, he knew, would be his sentence, and the lion, the silent guardian, seemed to wait patiently for the final verdict. Night fell, and with it a cold that came not just from the temperature, but from the soul. The grandmother, standing at the pit's edge, felt the weight of a world collapsing on her shoulders. Her eyes, once clouded with fear, now carried the burden of a deeper pain, the pain of betrayal. Elias, down below, was a heap of flesh and despair, thorns embedded in his body, his voice choked with panic. "Grandma, please, don't leave me here. I'm your grandson, your blood." The words echoed hollow in the growing darkness. Each plea was a knife twisting in the open wound in the elderly woman's heart. Grandson. Blood. The same blood that had tied her to a tree, offering her as a sacrifice to a beast. The image of her, helpless, the smell of imminent death, the icy terror that had invaded her, all projected onto the screen of her mind, more vivid than ever. The lion, who should have been her tormentor, had been her savior, and Elias, her own grandson, the executioner. The albino lion, majestic and still, observed the scene with a disturbing serenity. Its red eyes, once embers of fury, now seemed like mirrors of ancient wisdom, reflecting the raw truth of the situation. It did not roar, did not threaten. Its presence was, in itself, a verdict, a silent reminder of the scales that weighed the deeds of men. "I swear, Grandma, I was crazy. The money, the fame, they blinded me. I'm not like that. I love you." Elias tried to drag himself, but each movement was a new stab of pain. The thorns pierced deeper, tearing his already lacerated flesh. The despair in his voice was palpable, but it sounded hollow, devoid of any sincerity that could touch his grandmother's heart. It was fear, not remorse, that drove him. The grandmother closed her eyes for an instant, seeking refuge in the darkness of her own mind, trying to silence the clamor of the one who had once been her boy. She remembered the days she cradled him, the stories she told, the unconditional love she had dedicated. But that boy had died, replaced by a monster of ambition and cruelty. A low growl, almost a murmur, escaped the lion's throat. It was not a sound of aggression, but of warning. A reminder that nature had its limits, its own laws of cause and effect. The grandmother opened her eyes and looked at the beast. In that gaze, she found not the savagery she expected, but a deep understanding, an empathy her own grandson had never shown. The sun had completely departed, and darkness swallowed the savannah. Stars began to dot the sky, indifferent to the human drama unfolding below. The sounds of the night intensified, the melancholic chirping of crickets, the rustling of leaves, the distant howl of a hyena. The savannah was alive, and Elias, at the bottom of the pit, was just another element in its relentless chain. "Grandma, please, I'm bleeding. I'm going to die here." Elias's voice was now a hoarse whisper, almost inaudible, blending with the sounds of the night. He felt the cold of the damp earth rise through his body, the shock of constant pain, the dizziness of blood loss. The grandmother took a step back, moving away from the pit's edge. It was not an act of cruelty but of self-preservation. That abyss was not just a hole in the ground, it was the abyss Elias had dug between them. She looked at the lion, who seemed to nod, an almost imperceptible movement yet laden with meaning. Her hand, wrinkled by time and toil, touched her chest, feeling the void left by the betrayal. The instinct of a grandmother, of a protector, still fought. But the wound was too deep. How could she save someone who tried to kill her? How could she extend a hand to someone who pushed her towards death? With a heavy sigh that seemed to carry the weight of years of suffering, the grandmother turned away. Her eyes, once fixed on the pit, now lifted to the starry sky. There were no tears, only a chilling resignation. She uttered no word, made no gesture of condemnation. Her inaction was the cruelest sentence. Elias, from the bottom of the hole, watched his grandmother's silhouette walk away, accompanied by the imposing figure of the albino lion. Panic transformed into paralyzing terror. He had been abandoned, not just by his grandmother, but by humanity itself. The darkness of the pit became absolute, a living tomb, and the thorns, his merciless guardians. The last sound he heard, before despair swallowed him whole, was the rustling of leaves beneath his grandmother's steps and the majestic silence of the lion as they walked away, leaving him to the wild justice of the night. The rustling of leaves beneath his grandmother's steps, the majestic silence of the lion. These were the last sounds Elias registered before despair swallowed him whole. The darkness of the pit became absolute, a living tomb, and the thorns, his merciless guardians. There were no more pleas, only a silent scream forming in his throat, finding no escape. The thin air of that fetid hole seemed to steal his voice, leaving him with only the company of his own ragged breath and the painful throb of his wounds. The cold of the night, once a mere sensation, was now a chilling, penetrating presence. It seeped into his bones, mixing with the shock of constant pain and the dizziness of blood loss. Elias tried to move an arm, but the pain was excruciating. The thorns, sharp as blades, tore at his flesh with every slight movement, reminding him of the trap he himself had dug. It wasn't just physical pain. It was the pain of humiliation, of inverted betrayal, of the poetic justice unfolding around him. His grandmother's voice, which once cradled him with lullabies, now echoed in his mind, not with words of love, but with the deafening silence of her abandonment. He had watched her leave, her silhouette stooped yet firm beside the beast. She had left him. His own blood, his own flesh, had condemned him. The lion, the creature he coveted as a trophy, had become his judge, and his grandmother, the silent witness to his sentence. The panic that once drove him to scream now transformed into paralyzing terror. He was alone, completely alone. The vast and relentless savannah, which he had thought to dominate, now swallowed him without mercy. The sounds of the night intensified, each rustle, each croak, each buzz seemed like an omen. He could hear the distant howl of a hyena, a sound that, in other circumstances, would merely be part of the nightly symphony, but which now sounded like the song of his own imminent death. Would he be nature's next feast? His mind, once so focused on the hunt, on the prize, now spun in a whirlwind of regret and self-pity. "I'm not like that," he had screamed at his grandmother, but the truth, raw and undeniable, began to seep into his lacerated consciousness. He was like that. The ambition, the cold and calculating cruelty, the willingness to sacrifice everything and everyone for a selfish goal. That was him, and now he was reaping what he had sown. The smell of his own blood, once a detail, was now an invitation. For whom? For what? He tried to curl up, but the thorns wouldn't allow it. Every attempt to protect himself was a new torture. His eyes, adjusting to the darkness, tried to discern the pit's walls, but found only dancing shadows, distorted shapes that seemed to twist and draw closer. Claustrophobia squeezed him. The air grew heavy, almost unbreathable. Thirst began to tighten his throat. A burning sensation added to the searing pain of his wounds. He thought of the fresh river water, the food he had left at the camp, luxuries that now seemed unattainable, distant dreams of a life he had thrown away. The irony was cruel. He, the hunter, would die so ignobly, trapped in his own snare, abandoned by those he should protect. The lion, in its absence, seemed even more present. Its majestic image, its red eyes, the calculating calm. Elias felt that the beast was not just an animal, but a force of nature, an ancestral spirit that had come to restore the balance he had disturbed. The lion had not roared in fury when leaving him. It had merely watched, with a wisdom that transcended human understanding. It was the guardian, the executor of a law older than any human code of conduct. Night advanced, and with it, the certainty that there would be no rescue. No one would come. His grandmother, the only one who could have helped him, had made her choice. And the lion, the catalyst for everything, had ensured that justice was served. Elias closed his eyes. But the inner darkness was even more terrifying than that of the pit. He was surrendered to the savagery, not just of the night, but of his own actions. The thorns were just the beginning. The true torment would be the waiting, the slow and agonizing comprehension of his fate under the indifferent gaze of the stars. He, the predator, had become the prey. And the world, which he thought to control, was about to collect its final debt. The silence that followed the departure of his grandmother and the lion was not a relief, but a deafening vacuum, filled only by the throbbing of his wounds and the ragged sound of his own breathing. Elias was surrendered to the savagery, not just of the night, but of his own actions. The thorns were just the beginning. The true torment would be the waiting, the slow and agonizing comprehension of his fate under the indifferent gaze of the stars. He, the predator, had become the prey, and the world, which he thought to control, was about to collect its final debt. Every fiber of his being screamed in agony. The thorns were not mere scratches, they were tiny, countless daggers embedded in his flesh, tearing muscles and tendons with every involuntary spasm. The metallic smell of his own blood, once a detail, now saturated the thin air of the pit, a macabre invitation to the invisible predators of the night. The cold, which had merely bothered him before, now seeped into his bones, a chilling numbness that promised paralysis even before death. The darkness was a living entity, pressing in on him, suffocating him. His eyes, desperate for a point of light, found only dancing shadows, distorted shapes that seemed to twist and draw closer to the pit's walls. Claustrophobia squeezed him. The air grew heavy, almost unbreathable. He tried to move, to find a less painful position, but each attempt was a new torture, a cruel reminder of his helplessness. The thorns pierced deeper, and a silent scream tore at his throat but found no escape. Thirst began to tighten, an intense burning that added to the searing pain of his wounds. His mouth was dry, his tongue rough. He thought of the fresh river water, the food he had left at the camp, the luxuries of a life he had thrown away. They were distant memories, unattainable dreams. The irony was cruel. He, the hunter, would die so ignobly, trapped in his own snare, abandoned by those he should protect. The hours dragged on, each minute an eternity of pain and despair. Blood loss made him dizzy, his vision blurred. He felt his body grow cold, stiffness beginning to set in. The howling of hyenas drew closer, sharper, more real. Elias tried to scream again, but his voice was a mere hoarse whisper, choked by his own blood and terror. He was no longer the fearless hunter, the man who defied nature. He was merely a lacerated body, an offering to the savannah, a grim reminder that human arrogance always finds its limit. Death would not be a relief, but the last and cruelest of ironies. A fetid smell of carrion and damp earth invaded his nostrils, overpowering the scent of his own blood. It was their smell. He tried to open his eyes again, but his eyelids felt too heavy, glued shut by exhaustion and terror. However, through the slit of his half-closed eyes, he glimpsed a movement at the pit's edge, a slender, hunched shadow, followed by another and another, ghostly silhouettes with eyes that glowed like embers in the darkness, peering into the abyss. They were there. A low, guttural growl echoed, no longer distant but coming from above, from the edge of his private hell. It was a sound of anticipation, of insatiable hunger. Elias felt an icy shiver run down his spine, a primal terror that completely paralyzed him. His throat was dry, unable to emit any sound. His heart beat wildly, a frantic drum in his chest, announcing the end. He was the prey, and the predators had come to claim their feast. He closed his eyes, not seeking sleep, but to escape the sight of his own disgrace. The inner darkness was an abyss, filled with the ghosts of his actions. He had dug his own pit, and now he was in it, waiting for the end. The predator had become the prey, and the world, which he thought to control, was about to collect its final debt. The waiting was the true hell, the slow and agonizing comprehension of his fate, as the savannah with its sounds and smells swallowed him without mercy. He was just another broken link in the vast and relentless chain of life, a sacrifice to the law of the savannah he had ignored. Death was no longer a distant possibility, but a cold and palpable presence, lurking at the pit's edge, ready to descend. Death was no longer a distant possibility, but a cold and palpable presence, lurking at the pit's edge, ready to descend. Elias felt the air thicken, heavy with the acrid scent of hyenas, a nauseating mix of earth, carrion, and a wild primordial odor that heralded the arrival of the end. His eyes, once fixed on the void, now strained to discern the slender, hunched forms materializing against the pale starlight. They were no longer distant shadows, but tangible presences, with eyes that burned like hungry embers, fixed on him, the helpless prey. A low, guttural growl, almost a muffled laugh, echoed from the edge, followed by another and another. It was the language of hunger, the macabre symphony that preceded the feast. Elias tried to shrink back, but the thorns, like relentless claws, held him even deeper, tearing new wounds in his already lacerated flesh. Each movement was torture. Every fiber of his body screamed in protest, but terror was an even crueler master, paralyzing him, turning him into a statue of agony. He heard the dragging of paws on the loose earth of the edge, the sound of claws scraping against rock. One of the hyenas, the largest, perhaps the pack leader, leaned over the edge, its elongated head and dark snout peering into the pit. Its eyes, red and bright, met his, and for an instant Elias saw not just hunger, but a cold, calculating intelligence, the same he, in his arrogance, thought he possessed. The beast opened its mouth, revealing sharp, yellowish teeth, and a trickle of saliva dripped, falling into the thin air. A shiver ran through Elias, deeper than the night's cold, more intense than the pain of his wounds. It was primal fear, the certainty that his body, once strong and dominant, would now be torn apart, piece by piece, by these creatures of the night. He tried to scream, but his throat was dry, his voice a mere hoarse whisper, choked by his own terror. Panic, which seemed to have reached its peak, found new depths, a bottomless abyss of despair. The other hyenas joined the first, their slender, awkward bodies crowding the edge, pushing each other in hungry eagerness. The guttural cackling intensified, turning into a chorus of wild excitement. Elias felt the vibration of the earth beneath their bodies, the promise of their imminent arrival. He closed his eyes, not to escape the sight, but because the image of those beasts was unbearable, the mirror of his own downfall. Suddenly, a different sound, not a growl, but a dry snap, followed by a thud. One of the hyenas, perhaps the boldest, had jumped. Elias felt the impact not on his body, but on the earth around him. The creature had fallen into the pit, a few feet from him. The fetid smell became overwhelming, and he could hear the dragging of paws, the rustling of thorns, as the hyena moved, cautious, but determined. The others above cackled even louder, encouraging. He opened his eyes, and the darkness of the pit was torn open by the sight of the hyena. It was larger than he imagined, its muscles tense beneath its spotted hide. Its eyes, even brighter up close, were fixed on him, assessing the prey. The creature approached slowly, sniffing the air, its snout moving from side to side. Elias could feel the beast's hot, fetid breath, the promise of his imminent death. A scream this time managed to escape his cracked lips, a hoarse, desperate sound that was lost in the vastness of the savannah. The hyena paused, its head tilted, as if savoring the sound of his despair. Then, with a swift and brutal movement, it lunged. Elias felt a searing pain in his leg, a tearing of flesh and tissue. He tried to struggle, but the thorns held him fast, and the hyena, with its powerful bite, had already sunk its teeth in. The pain was excruciating, a wildfire spreading through his body. He felt blood gush, hot and sticky, mixing with dust and sweat. The hyena pulled, tearing, and he could hear the repulsive sound of his own flesh being ripped apart. The other hyenas above now stirred with even greater frenzy, some of them beginning to descend, slipping and stumbling on the thorns, but driven by the promise of fresh meat. Elias's mind, once so lucid and calculating, was now a whirlwind of fragmented images. His grandmother, her face wrinkled and disappointed, the albino lion, its wise and judging eyes. He, the hunter, now the prey, dismembered, consumed. The justice of the savannah, as relentless as he had been, was being served. He was no longer a man, but a piece of meat, an offering to the law of the savannah he had dared to defy. The second hyena arrived, and then the third. They threw themselves upon him, not with the ferocity of a lion, but with the voracity of scavengers, each seeking its share. The pain multiplied, transforming into unbearable agony, an inferno of teeth and claws. Elias felt his body being pulled in different directions, life draining away in hot gushes. His screams turned into moans, then into a choked silence. Darkness began to swallow him. Not the darkness of night, but the darkness of death. His vision blurred, sounds became distant, muffled. He felt the cold deepen, stiffness beginning to set in. The last thing Elias perceived, before consciousness completely abandoned him, was the smell of his own blood, mixed with the fetid scent of the hyenas and the sensation of being undone, of being erased, of becoming part of the very earth he had profaned. The predator had become the prey, and the savannah, with its teeth and its relentless laws, had finally collected its final debt. There was no glory, only the end. There was no glory, only the end. Elias felt the darkness deepen, not like the night that enveloped the savannah, but like a heavy veil falling over his own consciousness. The pain, once a searing scream echoing in every nerve, now became a distant hum, a white noise at the bottom of an abyss opening beneath him. His limbs, once torn apart by the hyena's fury, now seemed alien, detached, as if they no longer belonged to him. The cold, which had seeped into his bones, transformed into a chilling numbness, a perverse peace that promised oblivion. The sounds mingled, distorted and muffled. The wild cackling of the hyenas, the tearing of flesh, the cracking of bones, all merged into a macabre symphony that paradoxically seemed to calm him. It was the sound of nature reclaiming what was its, the sound of the debt being paid. He was no longer the hunter, the predator at the top of the food chain. He was the prey, the feast, and the world was merely following its relentless course. One last image, sharp and cruel, crossed his mind before darkness swallowed him whole. His grandmother's face. Not the wrinkled, disappointed face he had last seen, but the face of a younger woman, smiling, offering him a piece of fruit picked from the forest, her eyes full of an unconditional love that he, in his blindness, had trampled upon. Guilt, a monster he had kept chained for so long, finally broke free, tearing through the last defenses of his soul. He had betrayed that love, that trust. He had become the monster the savannah now devoured. The vision of the albino lion also appeared, no longer as a trophy but as a silent judge, its golden eyes observing with an ancestral wisdom that transcended life and death. The lion had not killed him out of hatred, but out of justice, for a balance that needed to be restored. It had been an instrument of nature, and Elias, in his arrogance, had underestimated the power of that primordial force. His breathing became shallow, a tenuous thread breaking with each weak beat of his heart. The smell of his own blood, once nauseating, was now merely a detail, mixed with the acrid wild scent of the hyenas surrounding him. He felt one last tug, a final tearing, and then the void. Darkness embraced him completely, no longer as a threat, but as a relief, a deep and dreamless sleep. Elias's mind, once so full of plans and ambitions, fell silent forever. The savannah, however, did not fall silent. The hyenas continued their macabre feast, their cackles and growls echoing into the night. More of them descended into the pit, drawn by the smell of fresh blood and the promise of a plentiful meal. They pushed each other, vying for the remains, the pack hierarchy dictating who would eat first, who would get the best pieces. Elias's body, once that of a strong and proud man, was reduced to mere fragments, an indistinct mass of flesh and bone, mixed with earth and thorns. As night gave way to dawn, the first rays of sun began to paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. The pale light revealed the scene of the pit, the blood-stained thorns, the churned earth, and the last vestiges of a tragedy. The hyenas, sated, began to disperse, dragging some pieces away to be consumed in safety. A slow, heavy silence descended upon the pit, interrupted only by the rustling of wind in dry leaves and the distant song of a bird. Elias was no more. The thorn pit, which he had created to trap others, became his own tomb. The savannah, in its majestic indifference, absorbed his remains, transforming them into part of its eternal cycle of life and death. The albino lion, who had been the catalyst for this primordial justice, watched from afar, its golden eyes reflecting the sunrise, a silent guardian of restored balance. The grandmother, somewhere distant, felt a shiver, a pang of sadness, and at the same time a strange sense of peace. She didn't know what had happened, but the oppression that had weighed on her heart since her grandson's betrayal seemed to have lessened. The savannah had spoken, and its voice was that of ancient law, of retribution. Elias had defied that law, and now he was merely a silent reminder that, in the wild vastness, no man, however ambitious, could escape his fate. The story of Elias, the hunter who became prey, was concluded, a grim tale whispered by the savannah winds. Morning arrived, not with the softness of a new beginning, but with the rawness of a newborn truth. The sun, an orange-red disk, stretched over the horizon, painting the savannah with hues of fire and promise. But beneath this beauty, a heavy silence hung, a silence not of peace, but of conclusion. The hyenas had dispersed, their shrill voices silenced, their bodies sated. The thorn pit now was merely a scar on the earth, an improvised tomb holding the last vestiges of a life consumed by its own darkness. Somewhere, not far off, the grandmother awoke. The shiver she had felt the night before, that pang of sadness mixed with a strange peace, now solidified into a chilling understanding. She needed no words, no witnesses. The savannah had spoken, and its voice was unmistakable. Elias, her grandson, her own flesh and blood, had met his end. A solitary tear ran down her time-worn face, not of despair, but of an ancient pain, the pain of a mother losing a child, even if that child had become a monster. It was the pain of lost hope, of betrayed love, but also the relief of a burden finally lifting from her soul. Her body, though free from her grandson's bonds, still felt the weight of age and ordeal. Muscles screamed in protest, joints creaked, but there was a renewed strength in her spirit, a resilience that only the savannah could forge. She rose slowly, each movement a small victory against stiffness. Her eyes, once clouded by worry and hurt, now observed the horizon with renewed clarity. The albino lion, the silent guardian, was not visible, but its presence was felt, an aura of power and justice that permeated the air. The grandmother began her journey back. There was no hurry, only the unwavering determination of one who knows the path and the purpose. Each step was a prayer, each breath an ode to the life granted to her anew. The savannah, which had witnessed her humiliation and fear, now saw her reborn. She was an intrinsic part of that ecosystem, an elder who had survived the storm not by brute force, but by wisdom and connection to the earth. The sun rose higher, and with it, the temperature. The savannah's heat began to press down, but the grandmother didn't care. She walked among the thorny acacias and tall grasses, her bare feet feeling the warm earth beneath them. She had no water, no food, but she had the memory of her ancestors, the strength of her lineage. She knew how to read the stars, how to find water in a dry riverbed, how to protect herself from unseen dangers. She was the personification of resilience, a living link to a past Elias had tried to erase. Suddenly, a movement in the distance. Her eyes, sharpened by experience, focused. It was him, the albino lion. He stood on a rise, watching her. There was no threat in its gaze, only a majestic dignity, a silent understanding. It was a farewell, a confirmation that justice had been served and balance restored. The grandmother stopped, raised a trembling hand in a gesture of respect and gratitude. The lion tilted its head slightly, a subtle acknowledgement, and then, with the same grace with which it had appeared, turned and disappeared into the golden vastness of the savannah, a living legend retreating into the shadows. The grandmother continued on her way, her heart lighter, yet still bearing the scar of loss. She knew that life in the savannah was relentless, but also just. Elias had defied the ancient laws, the laws of nature and respect, and nature, in its infinite wisdom, had exacted its price. She was the survivor, the guardian of memory, proof that greed and cruelty would never prevail over the essence of life. The sun reached its zenith, and the savannah pulsed with life. Antelopes grazed, birds sang in distant trees, and the wind whispered ancient stories through the dry leaves. The grandmother, a small but indomitable figure against the immensity, continued her journey. She wasn't just returning home, she was returning to herself, to the place she always belonged, a place of respect, connection, and deep reverence for life. Elias's story had ended in tragedy, but the grandmother's story, the savannah's story, continued, an eternal testament to the strength and wisdom residing in the wild heart of the world. She was the voice of the past, the hope of the future, walking towards the sunset, guided by the light of a new understanding. The savannah stretched before the grandmother like an infinite tapestry of golden and green hues, dotted with acacias and solitary baobabs. The sun, now at its peak, punished the earth with relentless heat, making the air shimmer above the horizon. Each step was an act of will, a small victory against the exhaustion that was beginning to settle in her bones. Thirst scratched her throat, and her stomach rumbled in protest, but she didn't stop. There was a silent urgency in her stride, not of haste, but of purpose. She was no longer the bait, the bound victim. She was the survivor, the guardian of a newfound truth. Elias had sought power and control, trying to tame nature for his own ends, but nature, in its ancestral wisdom, had refused to be tamed, and instead had reclaimed what was its own. The grandmother felt this in every fiber of her being, in the dust clinging to her feet, in the smell of dry earth and wild grass. Her eyes, once focused on imminent threat, now read the landscape with an intimacy that only years of savanna life could provide. She searched for signs, for whispers from the earth that would guide her. A denser cluster of acacias might indicate a dry riverbed where water could be found by digging. The flight of certain birds signaled the proximity of food sources. She had no compass, no map, only the memory of her ancestors and the keen intuition of one who lives in symbiosis with the environment. The image of the albino lion, the great spirit of the savannah, was still etched in her mind, not as a beast, but as an emissary, a judge. Its golden eyes, which had witnessed Elias's cruelty, had also seen the grandmother's innocence and suffering. It had not freed her out of human pity, but from a deeper understanding of balance, of a justice that transcends the laws of men. It was the very voice of the savannah, and its action had been a brutal reminder that life and death are two sides of the same coin, and that arrogance always finds its price. A warm breeze stirred up dust, and the grandmother pulled her tattered shawl closer to her face, shielding it from the sun and sand. She thought of Elias, not with the hatred he had sown, but with a resigned sadness. He had been her grandson, the boy she had taught to hunt with respect, to honor the prey and thank the earth. But ambition, like a parasite, had corroded his soul, transforming him into something unrecognizable. The thorn pit, the tomb he had built for others, had become his own end. It was a bitter but necessary lesson. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky orange and purple, the grandmother sought shelter beneath the wide canopy of an ancient baobab. The tree, a living monument to the passage of time, offered welcome shade and a sense of security. She sat, leaning her back against the rough trunk, and closed her eyes, allowing the savannah's silence to envelop her. The weariness was profound, but the peace she felt was even greater. She was not alone. The sounds of the night began to emerge, the distant croaking of frogs, the buzzing of insects, the rustling of leaves. The savannah was alive, pulsing with an energy that Elias, in his blindness, never understood. He saw nature as a resource to be exploited, an enemy to be conquered. She saw it as a mother, a teacher, an inexhaustible source of life and wisdom. The grandmother knew her journey was far from over. There were still many miles to go, many dangers to avoid, but she felt no fear. There was a strength within her, a flame that the ordeal had ignited, not extinguished. She had been tested, broken, and somehow rebuilt, stronger and more connected than ever. She remembered the stories her own grandmother told her, legends of savannah spirits, of animals that spoke, and of men who lost their way when they forgot their place in the great cycle of life. Elias had lost his way, but she, the old woman he had abandoned, had found her way back. The sky darkened and stars began to emerge, shimmering diamonds on black velvet. The grandmother raised her eyes to the Milky Way, a brilliant band stretching from one horizon to the other. She knew that each star was an ancestor, watching, guiding. She was not alone. She was part of something greater, something eternal. The night would be long and cold, but the grandmother was ready. She was the savannah, and the savannah was her, and together they would continue. Elias's story had ended, But hers, the story of resilience, wisdom, and unconditional love for the earth, was only beginning to be rewritten. She was the witness, the living memory, the voice that would whisper the savannah's lessons to future generations. She had nothing, but possessed everything: freedom, truth, and the promise of a new dawn. She was the guardian. The night on the savannah was not a veil of darkness, but a vibrant tapestry of sounds and shadows. Beneath the baobab's canopy, the grandmother felt the cold ground beneath her, but the warmth of her own determination kept her warm. The silence Elias so feared, and which she herself had felt as oppressive, was now a balm. It was the silence that spoke, that told stories of millennia, of hunters and prey, of births and deaths, of unbroken cycles that her grandson, in his arrogance, had tried to break. Her eyes, accustomed to the dim light, observed the stars that dotted the sky with dazzling clarity. Each point of light seemed like an ancestral eye, a silent guardian of her journey. She remembered the nights of her childhood, when her grandmother taught her to read the constellations, to predict the coming of rains, to understand the ways of animals. Elias had rejected this wisdom, trading it for maps and technologies that promised control, but only led him to ruin. Thirst scratched her throat, and hunger was a constant pang, but the grandmother had faced worse privations. Her mind was not focused on immediate pain, but on the lesson the savannah had taught her. Elias, in his quest for a rare trophy, had become the prey. The thorn pit, which he had dug so meticulously for the lion, had become his own tomb. It was the wild justice of nature, relentless and perfect in its execution. There was no joy in her heart for his death, only the deep sadness of a mother who saw her child lost, and the acceptance that some paths have no return. A distant hyena howl broke the silence, a reminder that night brought its own dangers. The grandmother tightened her tattered shawl around herself, not out of fear, but out of respect. She was part of that world, not an intruder. She understood the dance between predator and prey, the necessity of each creature to maintain balance. Elias had tried to subvert this dance, believing himself above it, and the savannah had responded with the voice of the albino lion, the guardian spirit who had chosen justice over the hunt. She closed her eyes, allowing weariness to envelop her, but not to dominate her. Her mind wandered through memories of Elias, the boy. She saw him running through the fields, his eyes shining with curiosity. Not greed. She had taught him to track, to shoot with precision, but always with the warning that life was sacred, that hunting was a means of subsistence, not a sport. Where had he gone astray? When did the sparkle of curiosity turn into the darkness of obsession? The answer was lost in the years, in external influences, in the insatiable thirst for more that the city and the modern world had instilled in him. The grandmother knew her way back was long. She needed to find water, food, and a safe path to her village. But for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel helpless. The savannah, which once seemed a place of danger and abandonment, was now her ally. She felt the earth's energy pulsing beneath her hands, the wisdom of the winds whispering through the baobab leaves. She was an extension of that place, a living witness to its strength and its ability to heal. The image of the albino lion returned to her mind. It was not a beast, but a being of power and purpose, an avatar of the savannah itself. It had gnawed her bonds, an act of liberation that transcended human logic. It had not saved her so she would live in gratitude to it, but so she could continue her own journey, so the lesson would be learned and the story told. It was the guardian of balance, and she, the guardian of memory. Night advanced, and the air grew colder. The grandmother huddled, but an inner warmth, a flame of resilience, kept her steady. She had no weapons, no supplies, only her sharp mind and indomitable spirit. She was the survivor, the one who had seen darkness and emerged into the light. The sun would rise in a few hours, and with it, the promise of a new day, of new opportunities. She needed to be ready. Her plan began to form in the darkness. At dawn, she would look for signs of water, birds flying in a specific direction, the presence of certain plants. She would move cautiously, avoiding open paths, using the cover of vegetation. She knew the savannah was generous to those who respected it, and she respected it more than ever. The grandmother closed her eyes again, and this time sleep came, light and restorative. She dreamed of rushing rivers, of her own grandmother's voice singing ancient songs, of the distant roar of a lion that was not a threat but a song of freedom. She was the guardian, and her story, the story of the savannah, would continue. She was the link, the voice, the memory, and with each dawn, she would be reborn, stronger, wiser, more connected to the wild heart of the world. Elias's chapter had closed, but hers, the grandmother's, was only beginning to be written with the ink of resilience and truth. She was living proof that nature, in its infinite wisdom, always finds a way to restore balance. The first ray of sun tore through the veil of night, painting the horizon with hues of gold and crimson. The savannah awoke with a chorus of birds, a hymn to life renewed. The grandmother opened her eyes, feeling the cold dew on her skin, but a different warmth, an inner strength pulsed in her veins. Sleep, brief and deep, had restored not only her body, but her spirit. She rose, her body protesting with aches and stiffness. Every fiber of her being seemed to have been stretched and twisted, but now a strange energy propelled her. Her mind, sharper than ever, was already tracing the first steps of her journey. Her first task was the most urgent: water. Elias, in his blind haste for a trophy, had forgotten the basics of survival, but she had not. Her eyes, trained by decades of savannah life, swept the landscape. She looked for signs: the low flight of birds heading to a watering hole, the denser, greener foliage in certain depressions of the terrain, the almost inaudible murmur of the wind carrying the scent of moisture, a faint promise in the dry air. She followed the scent, her eyes scanning the ground, searching for the greenest grass, the darkest earth, the subtle signs most would ignore. The savannah spoke, and she knew how to listen. She moved with deliberate slowness, each step calculated, conserving the little energy she had. The sun was already beginning to rise, promising a day of relentless heat. Her throat was dry, her mouth pasty. Hunger was a tight knot in her stomach, but the grandmother did not despair. She remembered her own grandmother's stories, of how the ancients survived, not by fighting the savannah, but by becoming part of it. She felt the earth beneath her feet, the vibration of wildlife around her. It was no longer an enemy, but a guide. She was the savannah, and the savannah was her. This was the truth Elias had ignored, and which had led him to his ruin. Suddenly, a distant roar echoed through the air, a deep sound that made the ground vibrate. It was not a hunting roar, but a warning, a declaration of sovereignty. The grandmother stopped, her heart beating fast, but without fear. She knew it was him, the albino lion, the spirit of the savannah. It was not a sound of aggression, but of presence, an affirmation of dominance over the territory Elias had profaned. It was the echo of justice, the voice of the savannah that had spoken for her, freeing her and condemning her tormentor. It was not hunting her, but reminding her of its presence, that balance had been restored. It was a sound of freedom, not of threat. She felt a strange sense of protection, as if the savannah itself was watching over her. Guided by a flock of birds that dipped and soared in the air, she finally found it. A small puddle of muddy water, hidden beneath the shade of a thorny bush. It wasn't crystal clear, but it was life. The water, murky and tasting of earth, was the sweetest nectar she had ever tasted. She knelt, her hands trembling, and drank in small sips, feeling the moisture revitalize her body, washing away not only thirst, but also the last vestiges of despair. Then, with the patience of one who knows the earth's secrets, she began to dig with her fingernails, searching for nutritious roots that the savanna hides for times of need. She found some, fibrous and earthy tasting, but which offered the essential energy to continue. As she chewed the bitter roots, the grandmother thought of Elias again. He had sought glory in death, in the trophy. She sought life, continuity. He had lost himself in the darkness of ambition, but she had found her way back to the light of ancestral wisdom. The grandmother felt a pang of sadness thinking of him, not for the monster he had become, but for the boy she had lost. Ambition, like a silent disease, had consumed his soul, blinding him to the beauty and interconnectedness of life. He had sought power over nature, and nature, in its relentless wisdom, had reclaimed its own. The thorn pit, a symbol of his cruelty, had become his final monument, a silent warning to all who dared defy the sacred balance. His story, the story of what happened, needed to be told, not to denigrate Elias, but to remind future generations the price of arrogance, the cost of forgetting man's place in the great cycle of life. She was the guardian of that memory, the voice that would whisper the savanna's lessons. She walked under the relentless sun, her skin wrinkled and weathered by time, but her spirit unyielding. Each step was a prayer, each breath a thank you. She wasn't just surviving, she was living, feeling the earth's pulse beneath her feet, the sun's warmth on her face, the wind whispering ancient secrets in her ears. The savanna was no longer a place of danger, but a sanctuary, a teacher, a home. As the day began to lean towards twilight, the grandmother sought new shelter. This time, a small cave formed by rocks, offering more protection against night winds and predators. She lit a small fire with dry twigs, not for cooking, but to ward off animals and for comforting warmth. The flames danced, casting long, ghostly shadows on the cave walls. The small fire crackled, its flames dancing like ancestral spirits, warding off shadows and fears. The smell of smoke and damp earth filled the air, a primitive and comforting aroma. She looked at the starry sky, the Milky Way brighter than ever. The fear that had paralyzed her when Elias tied her up was gone. There was an acceptance, a deep understanding of her place in the universe. She had been the bait, the victim. Now she was the survivor, the witness. The albino lion had been the instrument of the savanna's justice, and she, the messenger. The night would be long, but she was ready. With each dawn, she would be reborn, stronger, wiser, more connected to the wild heart of the world. Elias's chapter had closed, but hers, the grandmother's, was only beginning to be written with the ink of resilience and truth. She was living proof that nature, in its infinite wisdom, always finds a way to restore balance. And that balance, she knew, was the most powerful of forces. Sleep came in waves, interspersed with vivid dreams of the savanna, of the golden-eyed lion, and of Elias's face, young and innocent, before ambition consumed him. She awoke before the sun, feeling the cool pre-dawn air kiss her skin. Her body still ached, every muscle a silent protest, but her mind was clear, her spirit unbreakable. The fire had dwindled to shimmering embers, a last breath of warmth before the new day. She rose, stretching her limbs carefully, feeling the stiffness slowly yield. There was no time for lament, only for action. Her journey back to civilization, or what remained of it, would be long and perilous. The savanna, though now her ally, was still a realm of predators and relentless elements, but she was not alone. The voice of the earth guided her, the whispers of the wind carried directions. Her eyes, sharpened by necessity, swept the horizon in search of any sign of a path, a trail, a hope. She knew the general direction was east, where the mountains rose, and beyond them, the villages. She began to walk, the sun rising at her back, painting the sky with shades of orange and purple. Each step was an act of faith. Every few dozen meters, she stopped, listened, observed. The birdsong, the rustling of leaves, the smell of the earth, all were information. She avoided open areas, preferring the protection of bushes and trees, moving like a shadow, an indistinguishable part of the landscape. Hunger and thirst were constant companions, but she ignored them, focusing on the task ahead. She found more roots and some wild fruits she recognized as safe, a small feast to sustain her journey. Mid-morning, a familiar and chilling sound ripped through the savannah's silence, a roar. Not a hunting roar, but the same deep sound of sovereignty she had heard the day before. It was him, the albino lion. The sound came from a direction that made her pause. It was the direction from which she had come, the direction of the thorn pit. The roar was not a threat to her, but a reminder, a declaration that the territory was under its vigilance, that justice had been done and was being maintained. A dark curiosity pulled her. She knew she should move on, but an irresistible force compelled her to see, to witness Elias's end with her own eyes. Not for revenge, but for closure, so that the memory would be complete, the lesson unforgettable. She changed course, following the sound, her heart beating fast but without fear. The savannah seemed to open for her, animal trails leading her in the right direction. The smell came first, a nauseating odor of death and decomposition carried by the warm wind. Then the flies, a swarm buzzing over something invisible. She approached cautiously, her body tense, her eyes fixed, and then she saw the thorn pit. Exactly as Elias had described it, but far more terrible in reality. The steep walls, lined with sharp, poisonous thorns, gleamed under the sun. And at the bottom, a shapeless, unrecognizable mass caught among the barbs. There was no doubt. It was Elias. Nature had claimed its price. The silence around the pit was heavy, a mute testament to the tragedy. No animal approached, as if the earth itself were in mourning or repulsion. The grandmother felt a knot in her throat. There was no triumph, only a deep pain. She knelt at the edge of the pit, not to mourn the monster, but to lament the boy he could have been. Ambition, the thirst for a trophy, had transformed her grandson into something unrecognizable, and now the savannah had turned him to dust. The albino lion was not there. It had fulfilled its role, and now silence was its legacy. She stayed there for a long time, absorbing the scene, engraving it in her memory. This was the truth that needed to be told. The story of human arrogance against the wisdom of nature. The story of a lion that was not a beast, but a guardian. The story of a grandmother who was bait and became a messenger. With a heavy sigh she stood. The sun was high, and time was precious. There was nothing left for her there. She turned her back on the pit, on her grandson's tomb, and continued her journey. The pain of loss was still there, but now it was mixed with a fierce determination. She was the guardian of memory, and her voice would be the echo of the savannah. She wasn't just surviving, she was carrying a message, a warning, a promise. The promise that balance, however challenged, always prevails, and she, the grandmother, would be the living proof of this, the voice that would tell the story of the lion, the pit, and the savannah's silent redemption. With each step, she felt the earth's strength beneath her feet, the wisdom of ancestors in her heart, and the story, her story, pulsing in her veins, ready to be told. The savannah stretched before her, vast and relentless, but now, to her, it was a map of memories and lessons. Each step was a prayer, each breath a thank you. The morning sun kissed her wrinkled skin, and the wind whispered ancient secrets in her ears. She wasn't just walking back home, she was carrying the weight of a truth, the promise of a story that needed to be told. The journey was long, The dangers many, but fear had been replaced by an iron determination, forged in the depths of the thorn pit and in the unexpected grace of an albino lion. Days transformed into a tapestry of challenges and small victories. Hunger and thirst were constant companions, but the grandmother had learned to read the earth's signs: bitter roots, wild fruits hidden in dense foliage, a dew collected on broad leaves at dawn. Each was a gift from the savannah. She moved with the caution of a wild animal, her senses sharpened by necessity, her eyes sweeping the horizon in search of danger or a path. Nights were cold, filled with the mysterious sounds of nocturnal life, but the fire, however small, was a shield against shadows and predators. One afternoon, while crossing a dry riverbed, a group of hungry hyenas surrounded her. Their eyes gleamed in the dim light, and their snarls were a chilling chorus. The old fear tried to creep in, but she pushed it back. Instead of fleeing, the grandmother stood firm, raising a dry branch and striking it against the ground with force, emitting a primal cry that echoed across the landscape. It was not a scream of panic, but of authority, of one who had faced death and no longer feared it. The hyenas, surprised by her audacity, hesitated and then, one by one, retreated, disappearing into the vegetation. The savannah had taught her to survive, not just with cunning, but with the strength of spirit. After what seemed like ages, a sign of humanity appeared on the horizon. A thin column of smoke, rising lazily into the blue sky. The smell of burning wood, and then the distant sound of voices and children's laughter. A wave of emotion hit her, a mix of relief and a strange melancholy. She was returning to the world of men, but the world she had left behind, the world of the savannah and the albino lion, had transformed her forever. She was no longer the same woman. As she approached the village, the first to see her were the children, who stopped their games and watched her with curiosity and a touch of apprehension. Her thin figure, tangled white hair, torn clothes and deep gaze told a story even before she opened her mouth. Soon adults gathered, their faces showing a mix of shock and recognition. It was Elias's grandmother, the woman everyone thought had been lost forever in the clutches of the savannah. Murmurs spread and a circle formed around her. She did not speak immediately. First, she accepted the water and food offered to her, feeling life return to her limbs. Her eyes swept over the anxious faces, faces that knew Elias, that perhaps admired him. She knew her story would be hard to digest, but it was a necessary story. With a deep sigh, she began to speak, her voice hoarse at first, but gaining strength and clarity with each word. She told of Elias's ambition, of the cruel trap, of the pain of being tied up as bait. People listened in stunned silence, some shocked, others incredulous, but she didn't stop. She described the albino lion, not as a bloodthirsty beast, but as a creature of ancestral wisdom whose golden eyes seemed to see the soul. She narrated the moment the beast gnawed the ropes, the unexpected freedom, the inversion of roles. And finally, she described the thorn pit, Elias's fate, the relentless justice of the savannah. Her voice was a thread weaving the tapestry of truth. And as she spoke, disbelief on the listeners' faces gave way to understanding, and then to awe. They saw not only Elias's tragedy, but the profound wisdom of nature, the interconnectedness of all life. The grandmother's story spread like the wind across the savannah, reaching distant villages, transforming into legend. She became the storyteller of the white lion, a revered figure whose voice carried the lessons of the great cycle of life. She spent the rest of her days sharing her experience, not to condemn Elias, but to teach, to remind everyone that nature is not an enemy to be conquered, but a master to be respected. She spoke of human arrogance, of the cost of forgetting our place, and of the beauty of balance. Her eyes, now older and wiser, shone with the light of 1,000 stars, and her presence emanated a deep peace. The thorn pit became a silent landmark, a warning, but the grandmother's story was the true lesson. She was living proof that even in the depths of despair, nature finds a way to restore order, to heal, and to remind us that we are just a part of something much larger. And so, the story of the albino lion, of the bait and the hunter, was not a story of final tragedy, but of redemption, of wisdom, and of the unbreakable power of life. The grandmother, the messenger of the savannah, lived to ensure that truth would never be forgotten.